My name is Amanda. For 12 years I was a woman who lived in the quiet shadows of a marriage I thought was my sanctuary, only to realize I was protecting a house built on sand. Today I am opening the doors to my most vulnerable memories, not to dwell on the pain, but to show you that even when your world is shattered into 1,000 pieces, you have the power to pick them up and build something far more beautiful. Before we begin this journey together, I want to express my deepest, most humble gratitude to you for being here. Your time is a gift, and I am profoundly moved that you've chosen to spend it with me. If this story touches your heart or mirrors a struggle you are facing, I invite you to join our family by subscribing to Queen's Revenge. To those who have already subscribed and stood by me, may your lives be blessed with an abundance of wealth, may your paths be paved with prosperity, and may your heart stay forever full of the kind of happiness that no one can ever take away. Remember, you are never just a victim of your circumstances. You are the architect of your future. Let this story be your reminder that your crown may be heavy, but it is yours to wear. Now let us go back to that cold morning at Maplewood Manor, when the first knock changed everything. The morning air was not merely cold. It was bracingly antiseptic, a sharp, wintry draft that seeped through the ancient floorboards of Maplewood Manor like a silent intruder. I stood in the kitchen, my fingers curled around a ceramic mug of coffee that had long since surrendered its warmth. The steam had vanished, leaving behind a dark, stagnant pool that mirrored the gray light filtering through the frost-etched windows. For a moment, the house was a sanctuary of absolute silence, a fragile piece I had spent the last several months meticulously constructing from the wreckage of my dignity. Then came the knock. It wasn't the hesitant tap of a neighbor or the polite rap of a delivery driver. It was a sharp rhythmic pounding, a percussive assault that vibrated through the heavy oak of the front door and echoed in the hollow spaces of my chest. It was a sound that didn't ask for entry. It demanded surrender. I didn't move at first. I let the sound linger, watching the way the dust motes danced in the pale light, oblivious to the storm at the threshold. I set the mug down on the marble countertop, the same marble Julian and I had picked out 3 years ago, during a summer when I still believed that love was a solid foundation rather than a shifting sandbank. I smoothed the lapels of my silk robe, a deep emerald fabric that felt like armor against the chill, and walked toward the foyer. Every step was a calculation. I knew who was behind that door. I had felt her presence in the periphery of my life for months, a spectral figure in the background of Julian's late nights at the office, a scent of cloying, expensive perfume on his collars, a shadow that had eventually stepped into the light to consume everything I had built. I gripped the brass handle, took one measured breath that tasted of copper and adrenaline, and pulled the door open. There she stood, Lorena. She was a vision of predatory elegance. She wore a camel hair designer coat, the kind of garment that cost more than a year's worth of mortgage payments, likely purchased with the joint credit card Julian had lost 6 months ago. Her blonde hair was coiffed into a sleek, impenetrable helmet of gold, and her lips were painted a shade of red so aggressive it looked like a fresh wound. But it was her eyes that held the true weapon, a shimmering vitriolic glee. She was grinning, an expression of such profound smugness that it felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus. "Amanda," she said, her voice a melodic purr that carried the sharp edge of a razor. "I'd say it's good to see you, but we both know I've never been a very good liar." I didn't offer her the satisfaction of a retort. I simply stood there, my expression a mask of glacial indifference. "You're early, Lorena. The trash collection doesn't usually arrive until Thursday." Her grin didn't falter. It widened, turning into something jagged and triumphant. She didn't wait for an invitation. She took a deliberate step forward, the heel of her boot clicking against the threshold, my threshold, with the weight of an executioner's axe. "Oh, I'm not here for the trash, darling. I'm here for the keys." She reached into the pocket of that exquisite coat and pulled out a folded document. She held it out between 2 manicured fingers, waving it slightly as if it were a white flag she expected me to hoist. "Julian didn't tell you? Poor thing. I suppose he wanted it to be a surprise." She tilted her head, watching me with the raptorial intensity of a hawk circling a wounded rabbit. "We're moving in, Amanda. By sunset. This house, this land. It's ours now. Julian signed the transfer papers yesterday. He said he wanted a fresh start, and honestly, This place has far too much old wife energy for my taste. We'll be renovating, of course. Tearing down the old to make room for the new. The air in my lungs turned to ice. 1,000 memories flashed through my mind in a frantic strobe light blur. The way the sun hit the staircase at 4 p.m., the height marks we'd carved into the pantry door for a future we never had, the sheer, exhausting effort I had poured into keeping this estate alive while Julian was busy burning it down. For a heartbeat, the urge to scream, to claw that hideous grin off her face, was so overwhelming I could taste the salt of my own fury. But I didn't flinch. I didn't let a single tremor betray the earthquake occurring beneath my skin. I took the document from her. The paper felt cheap, despite the official-looking seals. I didn't even look at it. Instead, I looked directly into her eyes, searching for the crack in her armor, the tiny seed of doubt that she was trying so desperately to hide behind her theatrical audacity. By sunset, I asked, my voice coming out low and terrifyingly calm. That's quite a tight schedule, Elena. Moving is such a permanent business. Are you sure you've packed everything? Your conscience. Your common sense. Elena laughed, a sharp, tittering sound that grated against the silence of the manor. Keep your theatrics, Amanda. They're all you have left. Julian is at the hotel right now, checking out. He'll be here with the trucks in 3 hours. I suggest you start boxing up your memories. Though if I were you, I'd just leave them. They're clearly outdated. She brushed past me, her coat fluttering against my arm like the wing of a carrion bird. She walked into the foyer, turning in a slow circle, her gaze appraising the chandelier, the oil paintings, the crown molding. She was already mentally stripping the wallpaper, already erasing me from the rooms I had bled for. I let her have her moment. I let her drink in the hollow victory of a squatter who thinks she's a queen. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms, watching her with a pity that was far more lethal than anger. She didn't know about the files tucked away in my study. She didn't know about the silent 3-month-long investigation into Julian's creative accounting. She didn't know about the trust my grandmother had established, a legal fortress that Julian's signature couldn't even dent, let alone demolish. And she certainly didn't know that Mr. Sterling was currently sitting in my library, finishing a second cup of tea and waiting for the signal to deliver the coup de grace. Elena turned back to me, her face flushed with the high of her perceived conquest. Why aren't you crying, Amanda? I expected more resistance. It's almost boring how easily you're giving up. I allowed a small crystalline curve to touch the corners of my lips. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the grin of a predator that had finally lured its prey into the kill zone. I'm not giving up, Elena, I said softly, the words hanging in the air like a promise. I'm just enjoying the view. It's not every day one gets to watch a car crash in slow motion. She frowned, her eyebrows knitting together in a brief flash of irritation. You're delusional. Check the papers. It's legal. It's over. Oh, it's certainly legal, I replied, stepping back into the house and gesturing for her to follow me toward the library. But over is a very subjective term. Won't you come in? I think you should meet my guest. He has some documentation of his own, and I think you'll find his fresh start is going to look a lot more like a dead end. As she followed me, her heels clicking with a slightly less confident rhythm, I felt the cold morning air finally begin to warm. The game hadn't just begun. It was already won. The sound of Elena's stilettos against the Brazilian cherrywood was more than a noise. It was a staccato desecration. Each strike of her heel was a metronome of disrespect, counting down the seconds of a life she believed she had already extinguished. I watched her, my hands folded hidden within the deep silk pockets of my robe, as she performed a grotesque victory lap through the hallway. These were the floors I had polished on my hands and knees when the staff was away, seeking the meditative rhythm of labor to drown out the growing silence of Julian's affection. I knew every grain, every subtle indentation where the wood breathed. To her it was merely a stage. To me it was the very skin of my existence. You know, Amanda, she remarked, her voice echoing with a hollow metallic vibrato against the high ceilings. She reached out, her fingers, tipped with those predatory blood-red nails, tracing the intricate mahogany wainscoting. Julian always said you were obsessed with this place. A museum of mediocrity, he called it. He felt like he was living in a mausoleum dedicated to your grandmother's ghost rather than a home for a man with appetites. She paused by a Louis XIV console table, running her hand over the gilded edge with a proprietary flick of her wrist. I suppose some women are built for maintenance, while others are built for enjoyment. It takes a certain kind of spirit to truly inhabit a space like this. Julian finally found a woman who doesn't just dust the crown molding, but actually deserves to live beneath it. I remained an anchor of silence in the wake of her effervescent cruelty. I didn't defend the house, nor did I defend my pathetic life. To argue with a parasite is to acknowledge its right to feed. Instead, I watched the way her eyes darted to the archway leading to the study, the room Julian had always used to hide his secrets, and the room where I had spent the last 90 days unearthing them. It's almost tragic, really, she continued, turning to face me, her hip cocked in a pose of rehearsed dominance. Watching you linger here like a scent that won't quite wash out. But don't worry. Once we bring in the decorators, once we strip the heavy drapes and let some actual light into this tomb, you won't even be a footnote in the history of Maplewood Manor. You'll just be the starter wife who kept the seat warm. The air in the foyer was heavy with the scent of her perfume, something sickly sweet and synthetic that warred with the honest smells of beeswax and old books. She thought she was the storm, but she was merely the wind that precedes the collapse of a levee. Are you finished? I asked. My voice was a low-frequency hum, devoid of the shrillness she so clearly craved. Or would you like to critique the plumbing before you're escorted out? Elena let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Escorted out? Darling, the only person being escorted anywhere is you. I've seen the papers. I've seen Julian's signature. He's the head of the household, the provider, the man who holds the keys. You're just a squatter with a pedigree. She took another step toward the study, her confidence swelling like a malignant tumor. She reached for the heavy brass handle of the double doors, her grin reaching its apogee of arrogance. I think I'll start by throwing out those hideous velvet chairs in the library. They smell like. She stopped. The door didn't need to be opened. It was already ajar, a sliver of darkness amidst the morning's gray light. From that shadow, a figure manifested. He didn't move with the frantic energy of a man trying to be noticed. He possessed the monolithic stillness of an ancient cliffside. Mr. Sterling stepped into the light. He was dressed in a charcoal suit so sharp it looked like it could cut the air. His silver hair was swept back with severe precision, and his spectacles caught the light, obscuring his eyes in a twin flash of cold, clinical intellect. He held a leather-bound folder against his chest like a shield of jurisprudence. The temperature in the foyer didn't just drop. It plummeted into a sub-zero vacuum. Elena's hand froze on the door handle. Her grin didn't just fade, it curdled. The predatory spark in her eyes was replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed darting of a creature that had just realized the rabbit it was hunting was merely bait for a wolf. I believe, Mr. Sterling began, his voice a baritone rasp that commanded the very molecules of the room to stand still, that the lady was speaking of maintenance and desert. An interesting choice of vocabulary for someone whose presence in this domicile is currently a matter of criminal trespass. Elena recoiled, her heels skidding slightly on the polished wood she had so recently mocked. Who are you? Julian didn't say anyone was here. This is a private matter. On the contrary, Sterling said, stepping fully into the foyer, his presence eclipsing hers with effortless gravity. When fraud, forgery, and the attempted theft of an ancestral estate are involved, the matter ceases to be private and becomes evidentiary. I am Elias Sterling, and I represent the sole and undisputed owner of Maplewood Manor. He looked at me for a brief second, a flicker of something that might have been respect passing behind his lenses, before training his gaze back on Elena. Under his scrutiny, her designer coat suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Her new woman persona began to fray at the seams, revealing the terrified girl who had hitched her wagon to a man who specialized in building castles out of smoke. Julian has the deed, she stammered, her voice losing its melodic purr and turning into a thin, desperate reed. He showed me. He signed it over. He said Amanda was too weak to fight. Julian, I said, stepping forward until I was flanking Mr. Sterling, is a man who mistakes silence for weakness and paperwork for power. He has spent 12 years underestimating the woman who kept his world from tilting. I looked at the molding she had touched, the walls she had planned to strip. You wanted to know why I wasn't crying, Elena? It's because it's hard to weep when you're busy sharpening the blade. Mr. Sterling opened his folder, the crisp snap of the parchment sounding like a gunshot in the silent hall. Shall we proceed to the specificities of your departure, miss? He paused, his lip curling in a micro-expression of fastidious distaste. Actually, your name is irrelevant to the legal reality. What is relevant is that the sun is rising, and your time in this house has already set. Elena looked from the lawyer to me, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The predator was gone. In her place stood a woman who was beginning to realize that the man she loved had not invited her into a kingdom, but into a courtroom. This isn't happening, she whispered, though the way she clutched her stolen coat suggested she knew exactly how real it was. Oh, I replied, my voice a soft, lethal caress. This is only the first chapter of what's happening. I'd suggest you find a seat, Elena. But then again, none of the furniture belongs to you. 12 years is a long time to build a life, but a terrifyingly short time for that life to turn into a sepulcher of quiet resentments. As I stood in the foyer, watching Elena's confidence fray under Mr. Sterling's clinical gaze, my mind slipped backward, retreating into the suffocating fog of the last decade. Our marriage didn't collapse in a single cataclysmic explosion. It succumbed to the slow, agonizing accumulation of dust. In the beginning, Julian's love had been a sun, all-consuming, blinding, and warm. But somewhere around year 7, the light began to shift. The warmth didn't vanish all at once. It simply became oblique, hitting me at stranger angles until, eventually, I was living in a permanent eclipse. It started with the late nights. Julian, once a man who couldn't wait to shed his suit and press his forehead against mine, suddenly became a devotee of the office. He would return home smelling of expensive scotch and the ozone of city rain, his apologies as rehearsed as a telemarketer's script. I would lie awake, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling the vast, cooling expanse of the king-sized bed between us, a desert of cotton and broken promises. Then came the phone. That glowing 5-inch rectangle became a third participant in our marriage. It was always face down on the nightstand, or clutched in his hand like a digital talisman. I remember the blue light of the screen illuminating his face in the darkness of our bedroom, casting his features into sharp, unfamiliar shadows. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking through me, as if I had become a piece of furniture that had been in the room so long it had simply ceased to be noticed. I was no longer a woman to him. I was a custodian of his convenience. I tried, of course. I played the role of the dutiful wife with a desperation that, in retrospect, makes my skin crawl. I organized the finances he ignored. I maintained the estate he neglected, and I offered him a grace he never earned. I thought that if I could just make the house perfect enough, the marriage would follow suit. I was a fool polishing the brass on a sinking ship. The snap happened on a Tuesday. It was supposed to be a rare girls' night, a desperate attempt by my friend Sarah to pull me out of the lethargic morning of my own marriage. We went to the Blue Velvet, a bistro tucked into a cobblestone alleyway that smelled of damp earth and old jazz. It was the kind of place Julian hated, too earnest, he'd say. We were seated near the back, the dim amber lighting casting a romantic, deceptive glow over the patrons. Sarah was mid-sentence, complaining about her boss, when my gaze drifted toward a corner booth, shrouded by a velvet curtain. There he was. Julian wasn't wearing his late night at the office fatigue. He looked vital. He looked electric. His hand was resting on the table, his fingers entwined with those of a woman whose blonde hair shimmered like a treacherous halo in the candlelight. Even from across the room, I could see the way he was looking at her, with the raw, hungry intensity he hadn't shown me in 5 years. And then they laughed. It was a shared, intimate sound, a private joke that excluded the entire world. It was a sound that told me, with absolute vicious clarity, that I was not just unloved, I was a ghost haunting a life that had moved on without me. Sarah followed my gaze and went silent, her hand flying to her mouth. I expected to feel the world tilt. I expected the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I expected to shatter like the crystal wine glass I was gripping so tightly my knuckles were white. But I didn't break. Inside my chest, something audible and metallic happened. A snap. It wasn't the sound of a heart breaking. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place. It was the sound of a machine being switched from empathy to execution. In that moment, the Amanda who believed in working through it died. The Amanda who valued Julian's reputation more than her own peace was incinerated. From the ashes rose something cold, something calculated, and something infinitely more dangerous. I didn't storm over to the table. I didn't scream. I didn't even let a single tear mar the expensive foundation I'd applied that evening. I simply looked at Sarah, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "I need to go home," I said. "I have a lot of paperwork to organize." "Amanda, honey, I'm so sorry," Sarah began, her eyes brimming with the pity I now despised. "Don't be," I replied, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "For the first time in 12 years, I can see everything perfectly." I walked out of the blue velvet into the crisp night air, and for the first time in a decade I felt weightless. Julian thought he was playing a game of cat and mouse, but he had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who managed the traps. The next morning, while Julian was still asleep, no doubt dreaming of velvet curtains and blonde halos, I called Mr. Sterling. I didn't ask for a divorce lawyer. I asked for a war strategist. I spent the next 3 months being the perfect invisible wife. I cooked his favorite meals while I downloaded his bank statements. I listened to his lies with a supportive smile while I met with forensic accountants. I watched him sign documents I had carefully placed in his path, documents he was too arrogant to read, assuming his little wife was just helping him with his business ventures. I let him believe he was winning. I let him believe he was outsmarting me. I even let him believe he could take my grandmother's house, because I knew that the higher he climbed on the ladder of his own hubris, the more spectacular his fall would be. The dust was finally being cleared. And I wasn't just cleaning the house anymore. I was purging the infection. The silence that followed my statement wasn't empty. It was heavy, laden with the ancestral weight of the women who had occupied these halls long before Julian's name was even a whispered mistake in my life. Elena stood in the center of the foyer, her chest heaving beneath the camel hair coat, her hand white-knuckled as she brandished the contract, like a holy relic that had suddenly lost its divinity. "You're lying," she hissed, the word escaping her lips in a spray of desperate venom. "Julian showed me the deed. His name is there. I saw it. He wouldn't lie about this." Mr. Sterling stepped forward then, his movement so smooth it felt less like a walk and more like a predatory glide. He reached into his leather folder and produced a single cream-colored sheet of parchment, real heavy bond paper that made Elena's document look like the flimsy grocery receipt it essentially was. "Julian," Mr. Sterling began, his voice possessing the surgical coolness of a coroner performing an autopsy, "is a man who suffers from a chronic inability to distinguish between access and ownership. He likely showed you a draft of a deed of gift, a document he drafted himself in a fit of manic desperation. However, a signature on a piece of paper is merely ink unless the hand holding the pen has the legal standing to move the mountain." Sterling adjusted his spectacles, the light catching the glass in a way that rendered his expression enigmatic and terrifying. "Miss, whatever your name is, I suggest you look at the ceiling, at the foundations, at the very soil upon which you are currently trespassing. This is not a common asset. This is Maplewood Manor." I stepped out from behind the lawyer, my shadow stretching long across the floor, merging with the dark corners of the study where my grandmother's portrait hung. I felt her then, a phantom presence, a lineage of iron flowing through my veins. "Julian spent 12 years trying to convince me that marriage was a merger," I said, my voice cutting through the air with the precision of a guillotine. "He spent our joint savings on your jewelry, on your weekend getaways to the coast, and on the business investments that were nothing more than black holes for my hard-earned capital. He assumed that because he was the husband, he was the master. But Julian always had a fatal flaw. He never bothered to read the fine print of the life he walked into." I walked toward Elena, my steps slow and deliberate. She retreated an inch for every foot I gained, her bravado evaporating like mist in a furnace. "Maplewood Manor was never ours, Elena. It was an inheritance from my grandmother, Evelyn Vance. She was a woman who survived a war and a bankruptcy, and she had a very healthy distrust of men with charming smiles and empty pockets. She placed this entire estate into an irrevocable spendthrift trust long before I ever met Julian. The maidenhood clause, as she called it, ensured that no spouse, past, present, or future, could ever lay claim to a single brick of this house. It is separate property. It is inviolable. It is mine, legally, spiritually, and eternally. The look on Elena's face was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. The triumphant, feline curve of her mouth began to sag, the corners twitching with the first tremors of a catastrophic realization. She looked down at the paper in her hand as if it had suddenly turned into a serpent. But the mortgage payments, she stammered, clutching at straws that were already on fire. Julian said he was paying the mortgage. He said he earned this house through his sweat and blood. Julian hasn't paid a mortgage in 5 years, I countered, a cold smile touching my lips. I paid the taxes. I paid the upkeep. I paid for the very air he breathed while he was plotting to throw me out. He was a tenant in my history, Elena. A guest who overstayed his welcome and tried to steal the silver on his way out. He didn't sign a transfer of the deed because there was no deed in his name to transfer. He signed a confession of fraud. I watched the triumph melt from her features, replaced by a gray, sickly confusion. It was the look of a woman who had bet her entire future on a horse that was already being led to the slaughterhouse. She looked around the foyer, and for the first time she didn't see a prize to be won. She saw a fortress that was closing its gates against her. Behind her, the shadows of the study seemed to deepen, the grandmother's shadow looming large. The house itself seemed to breathe, a long exhaling sigh of relief that the infection was finally being identified. Julian is a con artist, Elena, I whispered, leaning in until I could smell the synthetic sweetness of her perfume, the scent of a lie. And the problem with falling in love with a con artist is that eventually you become the mark. You didn't come here to move in. You came here to witness the end of his fantasy. And now I believe you have a hotel room to return to. Or perhaps a bench in the park. I hear the weather is quite bracing this time of year. Elena's hand dropped to her side, the contract fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. She looked at Mr. Sterling, who was already checking his watch with mercenary indifference, and then back at me. The predator was gone. What remained was a shivering, overdressed girl who had just realized she was standing on ground that would never, ever have her. He told me we were starting over, she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. He was right, I said, stepping back to let Mr. Sterling open the front door. He's starting over from nothing. And it seems you're right there with him. The silence in the foyer was no longer heavy. It was absolute. A vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen from Elena's lungs. I reached out, my movement fluid and deliberate, and took the fraudulent documents from her trembling, manicured fingers. She didn't resist. Her grip had become slack, her spirit already beginning to bleed out through the cracks in her composure. I looked down at the paper. It was a poor imitation of authority, linen weave paper from an office supply store, a forged notary seal that looked like it had been carved from a potato, and Julian's sweeping, arrogant signature. It was a physical manifestation of his psychopathology, a testament to his belief that reality was something he could simply manufacture if he spoke loudly enough. I began to tear it. I didn't do it quickly. I gripped the edges and pulled slowly, the sound of the fibers rending apart creating a sharp, visceral cacophony in the stillness. Rip. The sound was like a bone snapping. Rip. It was the sound of 12 years of gaslighting finally being silenced. I watched Elena's eyes follow my hands, her pupils dilated with a burgeoning frantic terror. Julian has always been an architect of smoke, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. I let the first half of the document flutter to the floor, a white scrap of useless artifice. He didn't just stumble into this mistake, Elena. This was a calculated, desperate attempt at identity theft. He spent 3 months trying to mimic my signature, practicing in the dark while I slept in the next room. He thought he was being subtle. He thought he was a ghost. I gripped the remaining half and tore it again. Rip. What he didn't realize, I continued, stepping closer until I could see the fine tremor in her jaw, is that every time he logged into his private laptop, every time he visited a shady notary in the suburbs, and every time he touched the digital files of this estate, a bell rang in Mr. Sterling's office. We weren't just watching him. We were cataloging his extinction. Mr. Sterling leaned back against the mahogany doorframe, his expression one of bored, predatory patience. A honeypot operation, miss? he interjected, his voice dry as parchment. We allowed him to believe his forgeries were succeeding. We let him think he was outsmarting the emotional wife. It made the final discovery during the discovery phase of the divorce remarkably efficient. I dropped the final shreds of the paper. They drifted through the air like snow over a grave, landing in a messy pile at Elena's feet, the debris of her new life. You think he won this house in the settlement, don't you? I asked, a bitter, mercenary laugh escaping my throat. He told you he fought for it. He told you he stood his ground and demanded what was his. The truth, Elena, is far more pathetic. Julian wasn't given anything. He was stripped. He was flayed of his assets, his credibility, and his dignity. The judge didn't just rule in my favor. The judge looked at Julian's creative paperwork and nearly referred him for criminal prosecution. He was lucky to walk away with his clothes and that rusted sedan he's so fond of. I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. It started in her eyes, the light of triumph extinguished, replaced by a dreadful hollow clarity. Her shoulders, once held high in a posture of borrowed royalty, slumped inward. The designer coat she wore, the one Julian had likely promised was a symbol of their new empire, now looked like a shroud. He said he was a king, she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. He said he was the one in control. Julian isn't a king, Elena, I said, my voice hardening into a glittering obsidian edge. He's a scavenger. He's a man who finds strong women, builds a nest in their shadows, and then tries to convince them that he's the one providing the shade. You haven't won a prize. You've inherited a debt. You've inherited a man who owes money to 3 different banks, a man who has burned every bridge in this city, and a man who is currently checking out of a hotel he can't afford. I took a step back, reclaiming my space, my house, and my future. You thought you were walking into a palace to replace a starter wife. But look around, Elena. The only thing you're replacing is my burden. You've taken a con artist off my hands, and for that, I suppose I should thank you. Elena looked at the torn papers on the floor, then at the vast, silent elegance of Maplewood Manor. The house seemed to shrink away from her, the very walls rejecting her presence. The predatory grin she had arrived with was long gone, replaced by the slack-jawed shock of the newly ruined. She wasn't the new queen anymore. She was just the latest mark in a long line of Julian's casualties. Now, I said, gesturing toward the door that Mr. Sterling held open with mechanical politeness, I believe your king is waiting for you in the parking lot of a budget motel. I'd hurry if I were you. Scavengers don't like to wait when the pickings are this slim. Elena's hands were no longer merely trembling. They were performing a frantic staccato dance as she fumbled with her phone. The designer bag she had clutched so victoriously upon her arrival now hung limply from her arm, an expensive accessory to a mounting disaster. She was a woman drowning in a sea of legal certainties, reaching for the one thing she believed could still float, Julian's voice. You're wrong, she whispered, more to herself than to the room. Her eyes were unfocused, darting between the torn scraps of paper on the floor and the unflinching silhouette of Mr. Sterling. He'll explain. He'll tell you. He'll fix this. He's Julian. He always fixes things. She hit the call button, her thumb smearing a frantic streak of red lipstick across the screen. She jabbed the speakerphone icon with a desperation that was almost visceral. The ringing tone echoed through the high-vaulted foyer of Maplewood Manor, a rhythmic electronic heartbeat that seemed to mocking the silence of the house. 1 ring. 2. 3. Then the connection clicked open. Babe. Julian's voice flooded the room. It was exactly as I remembered it. A booming, resonant baritone saturated with an unearned toxic confidence. It was the voice of a man who believed the world was a stage, and he was the only actor with a script. Are you in? Tell me you're standing in that dusty old hallway right now. Tell me the ghost of Christmas past has finally cleared out. Elena let out a ragged sob, her voice a thin, broken reed. Julian, there's someone here. A lawyer. He's saying the house isn't yours. He's saying the papers were fake. There was a brief, microscopic pause, the sound of a predator recalculating, before Julian let out a sharp, derisive bark of laughter. The sound was cavernous and cruel, vibrating against the very walls he had no right to touch. Fake? Don't listen to that bottom feeder, Elena. It's just Amanda's last-ditch effort to be relevant. She's always been dramatic, a professional martyr. Listen to me. Don't let her intimidate you. If she's still there, just start throwing her things on the lawn. The velvet chairs, the old books, the grandmother's china. Toss it all. If she resists, call the police and tell them we have a trespasser. This is our time now, babe. Don't let a bitter, middle-aged ghost ruin the first day of our life. Elena looked at me, a flicker of her earlier arrogance trying to reignite in her eyes, fueled by the bravado pouring through the speaker. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe that the man she had sacrificed her reputation for wasn't a hollow shell. I stepped forward, my movement so calm it felt like the onset of a winter evening. I leaned down toward the phone, my shadow falling over Elena's hands, and spoke with a glacial, terrifying clarity. "Morning, Julian. I hope you kept the receipt for those moving boxes." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was tectonic. On the other end of the line, the background noise, the hum of a distant television, the clink of a glass, seemed to vanish into a vacuum. The confident, booming energy that had filled the foyer just seconds ago evaporated, leaving behind a hollow electronic hiss. I could almost hear the sound of his blood running cold, the sound of his carefully constructed hubris shattering into a million jagged pieces. "Amanda!" His voice was no longer a baritone command. It was a strangled, high-pitched rasp, the sound of a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was made of thin air. "The very same," I replied, my voice a soft, lethal caress. "I'm standing here with Mr. Sterling. You remember him, don't you? He's the one who spent the last 3 months documenting your every attempt at forgery. He's the one who just watched your queen try to claim a house that hasn't belonged to you for a single second of our 12-year mistake." I can explain," Julian stammered. The transition from predator to prey was so absolute it was almost comical. "Amanda, listen, I was just trying to secure our future. I thought if I could just show the bank. You thought you could steal my grandmother's legacy and sell it to fund your midlife crisis." I cut in, my words falling like heavy iron weights. "You thought I was still the woman who would quiet her own heart to keep your secrets. But that woman died at the Blue Velvet Bistro, Julian. The woman standing here is the one who owns the roof over your head, the car you're driving, and every cent you've ever tried to hide." I watched Elena. She was staring at the phone as if it were a poisonous insect. The king she had hitched her star to was currently whimpering through a speaker, his masculinity dissolving into a series of panicked, incoherent excuses. "Julian," Elena whispered, her voice trembling with a new, sharper kind of agony. "Is it true? Do you have the house or not?" There was a long, agonizing beat of silence. Then a small broken sound, a muffled curse, followed by the cowardly click of the line going dead. The execution was complete. The dial tone that followed was the only sound in the room, a flat, monotonous drone that served as a funeral march for their fresh start. Elena stood frozen, the phone still clutched in her hand, her face a mask of absolute, soul-crushing humiliation. She looked at the torn papers at her feet, then at me, and finally at the open door where the morning sun was mocking her with its brightness. "He hung up," she whispered, the realization finally sinking into her bones. "He just hung up." "He's a scavenger, Elena," I said, turning away from her and walking toward the window to look out over the sprawling green acres of the manor. "And scavengers always run when the lights come on." Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, a dry academic sound that broke the spell. "I believe the sunset deadline for your arrival has been effectively cancelled, Mississippi. In fact, I have a car waiting to take you to the station. I suggest you take it before the police Julian mentioned actually arrive, at my request." I didn't watch her leave. I didn't need to. I heard the stumble of her heels, the muffled sob she couldn't quite suppress, and the heavy thud of the front door closing. For the first time in 12 years, the air in Maplewood Manor felt pure. The ghost in the foyer was gone, and the only thing left was the silence of a house that finally belonged to itself again. The dial tone from the previous chapter hadn't just ended a phone call, it had severed the final fraying tether of Elena's sanity. For a moment she stood in my foyer, the phone still pressed to her ear as if she could somehow conjure Julian's presence back from the digital void. Then, with a scream that sounded less like a human cry and more like the discordant screech of a violin string snapping, she hit redial. I didn't stop her. I walked back to the kitchen, the heart of the manor where I had spent a decade playing the role of the nourishing, silent wife, and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. The steam rose in a delicate, mocking curl against the morning light. I leaned against the marble island, crossing one silk-clad leg over the other, and prepared to watch the grand finale of a tragedy I was no longer starring in. Julian picked up on the first ring. He must have realized that running would only make the hunt more painful. "Julian, you coward!" Elena shrieked, her voice echoing through the house, bouncing off the portraits of my ancestors who seemed to look down at her with ancestral disdain. "Don't you dare hang up on me! Where is the money? Where is the trust fund you said was tied up in the estate? Where is the life you promised me?" "Elena, shut up and listen." Julian's voice was back on speaker, but the arrogance had been replaced by a bilious, cornered desperation. "Everything is just temporary. A liquidity issue. I told you once we got the deed to Maplewood I could leverage it for a bridge loan. I had it all figured out. It was Amanda's interference, her leverage." Elena's laugh was a jagged, vitriolic sound. "You were going to use a house you didn't own to borrow money you couldn't pay back? You're not a businessman, Julian. You're a bottom feeder. I left a man with 3 vacation homes for you. I sacrificed my reputation for a visionary, who turns out to be nothing more than a glorified shoplifter." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The bitterness of the roast was a perfect counterpoint to the sweetness of the moment. "Oh, so that's what this was?" Julian's voice turned snake-like, dripping with a new kind of venom. I could see him in my mind's eye, pacing a cramped, carpet-stained motel room, sweating through his custom-tailored shirt. "You didn't love me, Elena. You loved the zip code. You loved the idea of being the mistress of Maplewood. You're nothing but a mercenary in a designer coat I bought you with Amanda's money. And you're a fraud," she roared back. She was pacing the foyer now, her movements frantic, the predatory elegance of her arrival long since dissolved into a manic, unraveled mess. "You used me. You told me she was the one holding you back, that she was the anchor dragging you down. But she wasn't the anchor, Julian. She was the only thing keeping you afloat. You're drowning, and you dragged me into the depths with you." The exchange was a masterclass in mutual destruction. It was the sound of a sinking ship, finally hitting the ocean floor. The pressure of reality imploding the hull of their hollow romance. I watched them strip away the layers of each other's lies until there was nothing left but the raw, ugly bones of their greed. Julian realized he had traded a fortress of loyalty for a siren song of vanity. Elena realized she had traded her youth for a mirage of wealth. "I have nothing," Elena screamed, her voice cracking as she neared the apex of her rage. "I maxed out my cards for our launch, because you said your accounts were frozen by the divorce. I told my parents I was moving into an estate. How am I supposed to go back now? How am I supposed to look at myself? Maybe you should look at the starter wife you were so keen on replacing," Julian sneered, his voice fading as if he were pulling the phone away, perhaps looking for a drink to dull the sting of his own catastrophic failure. "She's the only one in this conversation with a brain. She played us both, Elena. She let us walk right into the blade." "No, Julian," I said, projecting my voice just enough for the speaker to catch it. "I didn't even look up from my mug. I didn't play you. I simply stopped stopping you from playing yourself." Elena turned toward me, her face a mask of incandescent fury, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She looked at the phone, then at me, and then back at the phone. She drew in a breath so deep it seemed to rattle in her lungs. "You're right, Julian," she hissed, her voice dropping into a register of pure, concentrated hate. "She's brilliant. And you? You're a worthless parasite." The word hit the room like a physical shockwave. Parasite. For 10 years I had felt that word boiling in the back of my throat. I had felt it every time I covered his debts, every time I excused his absences, every time I allowed him to take credit for the stability I provided. I had suppressed it to maintain the sanctity of a marriage that was already a corpse. Hearing it come from her, the woman who was supposed to be his reward, was the most exquisite symphonic catharsis I had ever experienced. It was the sound of the universe finally balancing its books. "Don't you call me that," Julian screamed, but the protest was weak, The dying gasp of a man who knew the label fit. What else do you call a man who bleeds women dry and calls it love? Elena spat. I'm coming to that hotel, Julian. Not to help you but to get my jewelry back. And if you've touched a single piece of it, I'll finish what Amanda started. I'll make sure there isn't a bridge left in this state that you haven't burned. She slammed her finger down on the end call button with such force I thought the screen would shatter. The silence that followed was tenebrific and absolute. Elena stood in my foyer, her chest heaving, the incandescent rage, beginning to cool into a heavy gray ash of humiliation. She looked around the hall one last time. At the wainscoting she'd mocked, the floors I'd polished, the history she'd tried to steal. She looked at me, standing by the counter with my coffee, the picture of unshakable composure. For a second I saw a flicker of something in her eyes that wasn't hate. It was a terrifying mirror-like recognition. She saw the version of herself she would have become if the lie had lasted another 5 years. A hollowed-out shell, serving a man who didn't exist. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out the door. This time there was no staccato desecration. Her footsteps were heavy, the sound of a woman walking toward a very long, very cold reckoning. I set my mug down. The coffee was finished. The eternal love was dead. And as I listened to the sound of her car engine roaring and then fading into the distance, I realized that the silence of Maplewood Manor was no longer a burden. It was a victory march. The front door stood wide open, a gaping mouth swallowing the crisp morning air. Elena had vanished, her departure marked only by the fading, frantic whine of a high-end engine and the lingering, cloying scent of her perfume. Mr. Sterling, ever the consummate professional, closed his leather folder with a decisive snap that seemed to signal the end of a long, arduous theatrical run. I believe my presence is no longer required, Amanda, he said, his voice regaining its usual academic dryness. He didn't offer a celebratory smile. He was too wise for that, but he gave me a slow, respectful nod that acknowledged the sheer endurance it had taken to reach this moment. The restraining order is already in effect. If Julian so much as breathes on your property line, the authorities will be notified instantly. For now, I suggest you change the locks. I watched him walk down the gravel driveway, his figure receding into the mist. When his car finally disappeared behind the row of ancient maples, a sudden, absolute silence rushed back into the manor. It was a silence so heavy it felt tangible, a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums and settled deep into the marrow of my bones. I was alone. I turned away from the open door and began to walk. This was no longer a defensive patrol. It was a ritual of reclamation. I walked into the dining room, where the long mahogany table sat like a dormant beast. For years, this room had been a stage for Julian's elaborate dinner parties. Events where I was expected to be the charming, silent hostess, a decorative extension of his success. I ran my hand along the surface of the wood. It felt cool and smooth, no longer vibrating with the nervous energy of his boastful lies. I could feel the house exhaling, the walls shedding the tension of his presence like a snake shedding a dead skin. I moved into the study, the sanctum where Julian had spent hours working, which I now knew was merely a euphemism for plotting his exit. The air here was still tinged with the faint, ghostly aroma of his expensive cigars, a smell I had once associated with power, but now recognized as the scent of a desperate man trying to mask the odor of his own decay. I touched the leather-bound books on the shelves. They felt solid, grounded. They belonged to my grandfather and through him to me. Julian had never read them. He had only used them as a backdrop for his vanity. Now they were back in the hands of someone who understood their worth. As I ascended the grand staircase, my hand trailing along the banister, a wave of profound exhaustion washed over me. It was a fatigue that reached far beyond the lack of sleep. It was the accumulated weight of 12 years of being the strong one. 12 years of holding a crumbling facade together with nothing but willpower and gritted teeth. The victory didn't feel like a fanfare. It felt like the end of a long, bloody siege. I was standing in the middle of a battlefield that also happened to be my bedroom, my kitchen, my sanctuary. The chairs were still there, the paintings still hung in their places, but the emotional cartography of the house had been permanently altered. Every corner held a memory of a lie, a shadow of an argument, a ghost of a betrayal. Reclaiming this space wouldn't happen in an hour. It would be a slow, painstaking process of debridement. I walked into the master suite. The bed was made. I had made it myself that morning, but I knew I could never sleep on those sheets again. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my head in my hands. The silence was no longer a vacuum. It was a blank canvas. I felt a strange fluttering sensation in my chest. Not the sharp jab of anxiety, but the vast, terrifying lightness of freedom. I had spent so long defining myself in opposition to Julian's chaos that I had forgotten who Amanda was when she wasn't a guardian or a strategist. I stood up, forced my legs to carry me back down to the foyer. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door. The morning mist had cleared, and the sun was now a bright, uncompromising orb in the sky. I looked out at the estate, the maples, the rolling lawn, the stone walls that had stood for a century. They weren't just assets, they were my history. I pulled the door shut. The sound of the latch engaging was a sharp, metallic finality. I reached for the deadbolt and turned it. Click. The sound was small, but it echoed through the entire house like a thunderclap. It was the final period on a long, tragic sentence. It was the closing of a door not just on Elena and Julian, but on the version of myself that had allowed them to matter. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door. The war was over. I had kept the house, I had kept my dignity, and I had kept my future. The price had been a decade of my life and a piece of my soul, but as I stood there in the resounding peace of Maplewood Manor, I knew the trade had been worth it. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up my now cold coffee, and poured it into the sink. I didn't need the caffeine anymore. I was finally truly awake. The manor had settled into a resonant stillness over the 48 hours since the foyer had been purged of Elena's scent and Julian's delusions. I spent that time in a state of suspended animation, moving through the rooms like a curator in a museum of my own history. I had already begun the process of erasure, stripping the guest room of the linens he liked, pouring his vintage scotch down the drain, and opening every window to let the winter wind scour the residual shadows of his presence. It was evening when the phone vibrated against the mahogany side table. The sound was a jarring intrusion, a mechanical buzz that felt like a splinter in the silence. I stared at the screen. Julian. A month ago. Seeing that name would have sent my heart into a cacophonous gallop of anxiety and longing. A week ago, it would have ignited a white-hot flare of rage. But as I watched the name pulse in the dim light of the library, I felt a strange, hollow sensation. It was the anesthesia of indifference. Picked up. I didn't say hello. I simply waited, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the static of a connection that should have been severed a decade ago. The sound that came through was not the booming, arrogant baritone that had dominated my life. It was a liquid, ragged tremor. Julian was crying. Not the quiet, dignified sob of a man in grief, but the messy, performative wailing of a child who had finally realized the world would not bend to his tantrums. Amanda, he choked out, his voice wet and unanchored. Please don't hang up. I didn't know who else to call. Everything is. It's all gone. Elena left. She took the jewelry, the clothes. She even took the watch you bought me for our 10th anniversary. I'm in a motel on the interstate, Amanda. It's gray. Everything is so gray. I sat back in my chair, my gaze fixed on the flickering embers in the fireplace. I listened to the rhythm of his breathing, a shallow, frantic staccato. This was the man I had once considered my son, the person whose approval I had chased like a starving creature. 12 years, Amanda, he whispered, pivoting with practiced ease into the only weapon he had left, our history. We had 12 years. You can't just delete a decade. I know I made mistakes. I was lost. I was trying to find myself, to figure out who I was outside of the expectations of this house, of your family's legacy. I got confused. I fell for a fantasy because I was scared of the reality of getting older. It was a lapse in judgment, a momentary fracture in my soul. I closed my eyes, finding himself. He spoke of betrayal as if it were a philosophical journey, an unfortunate detour on the road to self-discovery. He was attempting to use the very memories he had desecrated as a bridge back into my grace. It was a grotesque audacity. I need help, Mandy, he said, using the diminutive nickname he knew I used to love. Just a loan. Enough for a security deposit on a small apartment. Just until I get my feet under me, until the consulting work picks up. You have so much. And I have literally nothing. You wouldn't leave a dog in a place like this. Please. For the sake of what we used to be. I waited for the anger to rise. I waited for the urge to scream at him, to remind him of the forgeries, the lies, the way he had laughed about throwing my grandmother's china onto the lawn. I waited for the visceral satisfaction of his suffering to fill me. But the well was dry. In that moment of profound crystalline clarity, I realized that I didn't hate him. Hate requires energy. It requires an investment of the spirit. Hate is a cord that keeps you tethered to the object of your loathing. A fire that requires the oxygen of your attention to stay lit. Hate is for people you still believe are capable of being better. Julian was simply gone. He had become a narrative phantom, a character in a story I had finished reading. I felt a vast, emotional tundra spreading within me, a peace that was colder and more permanent than forgiveness. Julian, I said, my voice as steady and emotionless as a dial tone. Yes? Oh, thank God, Amanda. I knew you'd. I've been listening to you for 5 minutes. I interrupted, the words falling like heavy, iron weights into the silence between us. And the only thing I've heard is the sound of a man who still thinks he is the protagonist of my life. You talk about our 12 years as if they were a down payment on my perpetual mercy. You talk about finding yourself, as if my devastation was merely collateral damage in your quest for a hobby. Amanda, I'm desperate. The Bank of Amanda is closed, Julian, I said, a small mercenary smile touching my lips that he would never see. It was liquidated the moment you walked into the blue velvet with that girl. It was boarded up the moment you tried to forge my name. You aren't a husband in a momentary fracture. You are a stranger in a cheap motel, and quite frankly, your credit is no longer good here. You're cold, he hissed, the weeping suddenly replaced by a flash of the old venomous bite. You've always been cold. That's why I left. You're just like this house, stone and ice. If I am ice, Julian, it is because you spent a decade trying to drown me. I simply chose to freeze so I wouldn't sink. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I didn't want to hear his rebuttal. I didn't want to hear the sound of his voice collapsing back into a sob. I looked at the screen one last time, at the name that had once meant home, and now meant nothing more than a digital nuisance. I tapped the block button. The screen blinked, a brief, silent acknowledgement of the permanent severance. I set the phone down on the table and leaned back, watching the fire die out. The silence of Maplewood Manor rushed back in to fill the void. But this time it didn't feel heavy. Felt like an invitation. The final period had been placed. The sentence was over. And for the first time in my adult life I was the only one holding the pen. A month had passed since the deadbolt clicked into place, and the manor had begun to breathe again. The air no longer tasted of stagnant lies. It was crisp, filled with the scent of floor wax and the faint, bitter aroma of the Earl Grey tea I now drank in the mornings. I was learning the geography of my own solitude, finding that the silence I once feared was actually a rich, velvet tapestry of my own making. The knock, when it came, was nothing like the aggressive drumming of that fateful morning. It was hesitant, light, almost a question rather than a demand. I opened the door, bracing myself for a process server or perhaps a stray memory. Instead I found a ghost. Elena stood on the porch, but the woman before me was a shattered reflection of the predator who had once tried to claim my life. The camel hair designer coat was gone, replaced by a nondescript wool jacket that looked several seasons old. Her hair, once a gilded helmet of perfection, was pulled back in a fraying ponytail, and her face, devoid of the war paint of red lipstick, was pale, marked by the distinctive hollowed-out exhaustion that comes from a long-term acquaintance with betrayal. We stood in the exact same doorway where we had first met, but the roles had been stripped away. There was no queen, no mistress, no starter wife. Amanda, she said. Her voice didn't purr. It was a thin, brittle rasp, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I didn't step back, nor did I move forward. I remained an anchor in the threshold. Elena, you're a long way from the fresh start you promised. She looked down at her boots, her shoulders sagging under the weight of an invisible burden. I didn't come here to fight. I don't have any fight left in me. I needed you to know that you were right. About everything. She looked up then, and in her eyes I saw it, the mirror of my own past. The same glazed look of a woman who had realized her heart was a prize won by a thief. He drained me, Amanda, she whispered, a single jagged tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. My savings, my credit, my dignity. He told me he was investing in our future, but he was just filling the holes in his own sinking ship. When the jewelry was gone and the cards were maxed, he looked at me the same way he must have looked at you. Like I was just another piece of furniture that had become an inconvenience. A month ago, this confession would have been a sweet, intoxicating wine. I would have reveled in her ruin. But as I watched her tremble in the biting wind, I felt only a profound, clinical empathy. She wasn't an enemy anymore. She was a casualty. We were two survivors of the same wreckage, standing on different shores of the same storm. He is a master of the vacuum, Elena, I said, my voice softening, though I kept my hands firmly in the pockets of my cardigan. He finds a void and fills it with exactly what you think you're missing, until you realize he's actually the one creating the hole. He told me I was the one. She laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. He said you were the anchor and I was the sail. But I was just the fuel, wasn't I? Once I was burned up, he just moved on to the next spark. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She held it out to me with a shaking hand. He tried to sell these at a pawn shop in the city. I followed him. I got them back. I think they belonged to your grandmother's set. I took the pouch. I didn't need to open it to know the weight of the pearl earrings inside. It was a gesture of unsolicited penance, a fragment of the silver he had tried to steal on his way out. Thank you, I said. An awkward, heavy silence stretched between us. She looked past me into the foyer, her gaze lingering on the crown molding she had once threatened to strip. She didn't ask to come in. She knew that some thresholds once crossed in malice could never be crossed in friendship. I'm leaving tonight, she said, wrapping her arms around herself. Going back to my sisters in Ohio. Starting over. For real this time. Not the Julian version of starting over. That's the only version that counts, I replied. I gave her a small, solemn nod of recognition, the kind of look shared between soldiers who had served on opposite sides of a war that had left both their cities in ruins. I didn't offer her tea. I didn't offer her a place to stay. Some wounds are too fresh for the salt of forced intimacy. Good luck, Elena, I said. You too, Amanda. You really do have a beautiful home. She turned and walked down the driveway. Her gait was no longer a strut. It was the steady, focused walk of someone who was finally carrying their own weight. I watched her until she reached the gate, a lone figure disappearing into the afternoon mist. I stepped back and closed the door. The predator was gone, and the mirror had moved on. We were both stripped of the man who had defined us, and in that nakedness we were finally exquisitely free. I walked to the kitchen, placed the pearls on the counter, and looked out at the rolling hills of my estate. The war was finally truly in the past. The passage of 6 months had not merely been a measure of time, it had been a meticulous purgation. If the divorce was the surgery that removed the tumor of Julian from my life, these months were the slow, incandescent recovery. I had traded the sprawling, echoing shadows of Maplewood Manor for the focused, vibrant energy of the city's historic district. Here, amidst cobblestone streets and the smell of roasting coffee, I had planted the seeds of my own resurrection. I stood in the center of the Gilded Lily, my boutique. The space was an incandescent sanctuary, a world away from the museum of mediocrity Julian had once mocked. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, refracting through crystal chandeliers and dancing across the racks of high-end, sustainable fashion I had curated with a mercenary eye for beauty. The air here didn't smell of old books or desperation. It smelled of lavender, expensive leather, and the tactile promise of raw silk. The name was a reclamation. To gild the lily is to add unnecessary ornament to something already beautiful, but I saw it differently. I had been a lily, fragile, rooted in the mud of a deceptive marriage, and I had plated myself in gold. I had transformed my resilience into a brand, my survival into a sartorial aesthetic. My clients didn't just come here for dresses. They came for the aura of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged with her silk uncharred. I ran my hand over a bolt of emerald velvet, the fabric cool and heavy beneath my palm. This was my life now. Textures I could touch, colors I could control, and a bottom line that belonged entirely to me. I was no longer a custodian of someone else's ego. I was the architect of my own empire. The bell above the door chimed, a bright silver sound that always felt like an exclamation point. It wasn't a customer, however. It was a courier. He handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed seal of Sterling and Associates. I took the envelope to my desk, a sleek mid-century modern piece that sat in the back of the shop, positioned so I could see the entire floor. I opened it with a letter opener shaped like a feather, my movements fluid and devoid of the treacherous tremors that used to plague me. Inside was a final legal update, a postscript to a tragedy that felt like it had been written a lifetime ago. Mr. Sterling's report was as terse and clinical as the man himself. Julian's final attempt to challenge the trust had been laughed out of court, but that wasn't the headline. The headline was the fallout. Julian's final vestige of vanity, that silver sedan he had prided himself on, the one he had used to ferry Elena to secret dinners, had been repossessed. He had been found in a strip mall parking lot, arguing with the tow truck driver, clutching a designer briefcase that was likely empty. But the real victory, the one that made the breath catch in my throat with a sharp crystalline satisfaction, was the permanent black mark. The fraudulent documents he had filed, the forged notary seals, and the attempted identity theft had been officially entered into the public record. He hadn't just lost the house. He had lost the ability to ever again pretend he was an honorable man. In the world of finance and consulting, Julian was now toxic waste. His name was a warning label. He was a con artist who had been unmasked in the bright, unforgiving light of the law. I leaned back in my chair, the letter resting on my lap. A year ago, I would have searched this news for a spark of joy. I would have wanted to see him suffer, to see him groveling in the dirt he had tried to bury me in. I would have wanted his ruin to be my sustenance. But as I sat in the warmth of the gilded lily, surrounded by the evidence of my own success, I realized that Julian's misery was no longer my fuel. It was merely data. It was the inevitable conclusion of a flawed equation. He was drowning because he had refused to learn how to swim without stealing someone else's life jacket. The true revenge wasn't the repossession of his car, or the blackening of his name. Those were just the mechanical gears of justice turning. The true revenge was the fact that I had to remind myself to care about the news at all. I was thriving. I was healthy. My boutique was a shining beacon of independence in a city that had once known me only as Mrs. Julian Vance. I was a woman who woke up in a bed that I owned, in a house that I protected, looking forward to a day that I designed. I looked at the framed quote I had placed on the wall behind my desk, written in a delicate gold script. The most beautiful thing a woman can wear is the life she built for herself. Living well wasn't just the best revenge. It was the only one that mattered because it was the only one that didn't require his presence. By being happy, by being successful, and by being unapologetically myself, I had erased him more effectively than any court order ever could. He was a ghost, a shadow, a footnote in the grand, luminous narrative of the Gilded Lily. I stood up, tucked the letter into a drawer, the same drawer where I kept my tax returns and my expansion plans, and walked back out onto the floor. A customer had entered, a young woman looking for something to wear to her first major promotion. She looked nervous, a little overwhelmed by the elegance of the shop. I smiled at her, a genuine warm expression that reached my eyes. "Welcome," I said, my voice steady and inviting. "Let's find something that shows them exactly who you are." As I led her toward the racks, I felt the last of the residual chill from Chapter 1 finally leave my bones. The winter was over. The lily had been gilded, and the sun was just beginning to rise. The passage of 3 years had rendered the memory of Julian Vance into something akin to a faded sepia-toned photograph, a relic of a life lived by a woman I no longer recognized. My existence was no longer defined by the defense of a manor or the reclamation of a name. It had become a steady rhythmic composition of my own making. The Gilded Lily had expanded, but more importantly, I had expanded. My soul was no longer a fortress under siege. It was an open territory, bathed in the light of a self-sustaining sun. It was an unseasonably warm autumn afternoon, the kind where the light turns a viscous liquid gold, clinging to the turning leaves of the oaks and maples. I was driving back from a weekend retreat in the mountains, a solo journey I had taken to celebrate the anniversary of my independence. My car, a sleek midnight blue machine that whispered of engineering precision and hard-earned luxury, ate the miles with effortless grace. I pulled into a nondescript gas station on the outskirts of town, a place of transit where the city began to dissolve into the rural sprawl. The air was thick with the scent of dry grass and gasoline, a mundane, gritty reality that stood in stark contrast to the ethereal peace I had found in the highlands. As the pump hummed, I stood by my car, leaning against the cool metal, my gaze drifting across the lot. That was when I saw it. A rusted, battered sedan was parked at the far pump. It was a vehicle that looked as though it were being held together by nothing more than rust and resentment. The paint was peeling in jagged flakes, and the muffler hung low, a metallic limb dragging in the dust. And there, fumbling with a gas cap that refused to turn, was Julian. The shock was not visceral, it was academic. I watched him with the detached curiosity of a biologist observing a specimen that had long since lost its ability to adapt. He looked decades older than the man who had walked out of Maplewood Manor. His face was a map of sallow, sunken disappointments, his skin gray and translucent under the harsh afternoon sun. His clothes, once his greatest weapon, a collection of bespoke suits and Italian leather, were now a shroud of rumpled failure. His shirt was stained at the collar, and his jacket was ill-fitting, hanging off his narrowed shoulders like a borrowed skin. He looked unraveled, a man whose internal rot had finally, inevitably, manifested on the surface. He turned then, his movements slow and arthritic, and his eyes met mine. The world seemed to pause, the hum of the highway fading into a reverberating silence. I saw the exact moment the recognition hit him. I saw the flash of the old Julian, the spark of arrogance, the urge to spin a lie, extinguish instantly, replaced by a profound soul-crushing shame. He looked at my car, its polished surface reflecting the golden light. He looked at my face, which bore no trace of the pathetic wife he had tried to erase. He saw the peace in my eyes, the strength in my posture, and the unassailable independence that radiated from me like heat from a furnace. In that look, he realized that he hadn't just lost a house or a fortune. He had lost the ability to haunt me. He saw that the Gilded Lily wasn't just a business, it was the woman he had failed to break. He didn't speak. He didn't even try to offer a hollow apology or a desperate plea. He simply looked away, his gaze falling to the cracked pavement, his fingers trembling as he finally forced the gas cap open. He was a ghost haunting his own ruins, a man who had become a stranger to his own potential. I felt no urge to gloat. I felt no flare of the old white-hot revenge that had once sustained me. There was no need for words, for a final stinging rebuke, or a theatrical flourish. To speak to him would be to acknowledge that we still occupied the same narrative, and that was a lie I was no longer willing to entertain. The pump clicked, signaling the end of the transaction. I replaced the nozzle, the sound of the metal latching into place as final as a heartbeat. I got into my car. The interior smelled of expensive leather and the faint, clean scent of the mountain air I had brought back with me. I started the engine, the low, powerful purr a stark contrast to the wheezing rattle of the sedan at the next pump. I shifted into gear and pulled away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't check to see if he was watching me leave, or if he was still standing there, a gray figure in a golden world. I didn't need to know his trajectory because it no longer intersected with mine. As I reached the highway, the road stretched out before me, a black ribbon winding toward a horizon that was wide, clear, and infinite. I realized then, with a clarity that brought a smile to my lips, that I had finally outgrown the labels of my past. I was no longer a wife, defined by a man's name. I was no longer a victim, defined by a man's betrayal. I was no longer even a survivor, defined by the struggle to remain standing after the storm. Those were all roles played in a play that had long since closed. I was simply Amanda. I was the woman who built a life out of silken threads and iron will. I was the woman who knew the value of her own silence. I was the woman who had walked through the inheritance of silence, and found her own voice on the other side. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and fire. I pressed the accelerator, the wind whipping past the windows, carrying away the last of the residual dust of the 12 years I had left behind. I was Amanda, and that was enough. It was quite simply everything. Thank you for walking this long and winding path with me. Sharing the story of my past at Maplewood Manor wasn't easy, but I believe that silence only protects the person who hurt you. I share this not just as a victory, but as a reminder that your worth is never tied to someone else's inability to see it. Have you ever had to find your own gilded lily after a storm? I would be honored to read your thoughts and your own stories of resilience in the comments below. If Amanda's journey touched your heart today, please consider joining our community. Subscribe to Queen's Revenge and let's keep reclaiming our power, one story at a time.